the Skiffy and Fanty Show,
where the only thing sweeter than a ripe Julie mango is revenge.
Delicious revenge. You know, you can actually get that at the store these days.
Yeah. It's very expensive depending on where you go, though. But some places, the revenge is at the right price, so yeah.
It also kind of, how much you spend depends on how good of a revenge you want, so...
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
If you just kind of want, like, mild revenge, like someone stubs their toe or falls down a flight of stairs, I mean, you can usually get that at your standard grocery store, but, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I don't know what we're doing. I'm really sorry. I'm Shaun.
I'm Brandon.
And today, we'll be talking with the brilliant, dark, speculative fiction writer, editor, and Ignite Award co-founder, Suzan Palumbo. Suzan is the author of the collection Skin Thief Stories, and her work has been nominated for the Nebula, the Aurora, the World Fantasy, and Locus Awards. But today, we're here to talk about a book called Countess from ECW Press. So welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. I was so excited with this Julie Mango introduction. I'm beside myself. Like, oh my gosh, Julie Mangoes. But that, don't they just drop from trees back home?
I mean, yes. There was literally a mango tree outside my high school, and it was utter delight to me to just be able to walk out in the middle of the afternoon and go, "Hey, a mango," and then just go back to class. And yeah, this is how everyone should get to live, and the fact that there are some people who don't get to live like that is actually very disappointing.
Well, where I live, they don't grow, Brandon.
And that's your fault. You should fix that.
Got it. I will work on accelerating climate change as quickly as possible so Iowa can grow a mango.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, we might have mangoes in the botanical garden. That's possible. I don't know.
I believe in Iowa.
Maybe we should grow a cold-tolerant mango.
That's me. I am a cold-tolerant mango.
Oh, Lord.
What an interesting phrase. I love it. Okay.
Yeah, it's brilliant. I love it so very much. But yes, we have a podcast to do.
Supposedly.
So, before we get into this absolutely lovely conversation about this absolutely amazing book, Countess, I would like to remind all of our listeners to please share any comments or questions that you have about any of the content that we make over at Skiffy and Fanty, at skiffyandfanty.com/listener suggestions. We like doing the thing. We like doing the thing with you all. We like sharing this moment with you all on Twitch, in the podcast, on our blog. And we like it very much when you join us and tell us all of the wonderful thoughts that you have in your brain. And also, if you introduce other people to the show, just tell your friends, hey, the Skiffy and Fanty show does this weird thing on a Friday evening, where we talk to badass science fiction writers about their badass work, so they can also get to be here and enjoy all the cool things that we do. That would be really dope.
Absolutely. Okay, so our first question for Suzan is a question I imagine you've been asked before, so we're going to ask it again. But what the heck is this book about?
So, the pitch is, this was the pitch I sent to the publisher. So, It's a queer Caribbean Count of Monte Cristo space opera. It is gender flipped if you're going on the hard line of comparing it to the Count of Monte Cristo, but if you've read the book, you know that I don't follow rules and I don't follow plans, so the book kind of veers off. But encapsulate it, if you think of like the revenge sort of aspect and that kind of premise of the Count of Monte Cristo, then that's what this book is. It's got revenge. It's a space opera. It's a bit gothic. It's pulpy. It's kind of Star Trek feel at points. Dark fantasy moments. I put everything in there. It's like a kalaloo, like a stew.
Oh, yeah.
We mixed everything together and boiled it all up and made a book, a novella.
So I have to ask the question. I imagine you're going to get asked this, but I have to know, why the Count of Monte Cristo?
I assume you have read The Count of Monte Cristo.
I have actually not. That this is a gap in my
I
reading, and I know I'm about to get roasted on the coals for this. I'm so sorry.
I don't roast people.
I read it a
No.
very, very long time ago, and then it erased from my brain. So
Okay.
reading this kind of revitalized a lot of those thoughts, and I was like, ah, right, that was a book that I read when I was far too young to have read this book.
Right. Okay, so I have read The Count of Monte Cristo twice, and there are many reasons why I chose that book to riff off of. I read it once when I was a kid, and I read an abridged version, and I really liked the arc of Edmund being sort of a rising star, and everyone around him being sort of envious and angry, and also catching him in a very compromising decision that he's made, and then using that against him to put him away, get him out of the way, so that someone can get his girlfriend and someone can get his job and someone take all of the things that he has and like put him away. And him sort of uh, going through a kind of transformation and self-discovery in prison, and then coming back later and exacting personal revenge on everybody. I enjoy revenge stories generally. And then later on, when I was older, I read the whole book, which is much longer than the abridged version, and it's very intricate, and it goes into how exactly he connives his way into all these systems to bring down every single person who ever harmed him or his family. And then he leaves. And there's a lot going on in there. So I liked that aspect of the book. Um, there are a couple other reasons. Alexandre Dumas is a very, very early Caribbean diasporatic writer. His heritage, he is part Haitian
Mhm.
on his father's side. Um, and that the way I approached the book, I kind of went off on a different track, and I incorporated Caribbean history into the novel. And so Haitian history, Haitian revolution is central to parts of the book, and Alexandre Dumas is that. So that was important to me to include. And he's Caribbean, like me, diasporatic. So that fit really well. So that's why that book. I like that book, and it's all about revenge, and I liked the premise. I have more to say, but I'll let you ask another question.
So, um, one of the things very obviously that we want to touch on is the very strong, Caribbean influence, in Countess. Um, because like, you reminded me of this thing about Dumas that I already knew and keep forgetting every time I think about his work. But obviously, one of the things that is, key to how Countess imagines space in the space opera sense is the idea that there is no obvious distinction between interstellar colonialism and real world colonialism, and being very obvious and, dare I say, kind of unsubtle about that distinction. Just confronting the reader very obviously with these two things are the same, and it's affecting the same people in the same ways. And I kind of really wanted to pick up on that fact, like the idea that there are planets that are obviously named after regions and ideas of the Caribbean experience that a trainee reader will just pick up and go, oh, I know what that is. I know what's happening here exactly. And why I wanted to ask why you thought it was particularly important to take the Count of Monte Cristo, a work that people who don't know a lot about Dumas, or forget about Dumas as I did, typically think of as obviously Western, and imagine Dantes as very obviously a white man who deserves his station being undercut by all of these absolute villains, being compared to your protagonist, Virika Samaru, who still very badass, still very obviously deserving of the accolades that she's received, but is very obviously racialized in the work in a way that we're supposed to see and observe. Why you thought it was important to make that distinction in particular, that in your work, Virika Samaru is not only envied, but hated and reviled by people who would otherwise hate and revile her regardless of her station.
So, you got what I was going for. But what I don't know if I mentioned it earlier when I said the description of the book, but the very key part of this book is that it is anti-colonial.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted to make a I was very blunt about what you're saying about making her very racialized. And I have about 16 thoughts in my head that I'm trying to be like, which should I go with? So first you started off with saying that I draw a parallel between colonialism and space colonization.
Mm-hmm.
If you are ever on Caribbean Twitter, or X as they call it. Sometimes you will see people, or once I saw one of the tech guys saying, "Oh well, we can colonize space, and if people want to move to space, what we'll do is we'll let them work off their trip to space. We'll transport them there, and they can get a job, and they will work off their expenses to go there." And every Trinidadian person I know who saw that looked at each other and freaked out and said, "Oh,
Yeah.
no, 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 no. We are not going to work off going to somewhere, like immigrating to somewhere, um,
Mm-hmm.
uh, to another planet, because that's indenture. That
Yep.
is how they
Exactly.
caught us originally." And
Mm-hmm.
when people talk about space colonization, they separate it from the actual colonization that has happened already. They ignore it, or they pretend that it hasn't happened. Um, all of the words that are used about going into space, colonizing, mining, all these
Settling.
things, claiming places, settling, right? All of these words were used during the periods of empire expansion and inflicted on populations. And people of the Caribbean, as well as other places, are very well suited to discuss how that project runs through, and how what are the consequences and what happens to the people when you colonize somewhere. It is, to me, a direct analogy of England coming to the Caribbean and settling, to us going to a planet that we don't own, we don't know what's there, and saying, "This is ours, we're going to use it." Like, what is the difference to me? I can't see the difference in that. And so it strikes a lot of ethical concerns to me. Like, everyone's always like, "Yay, we're going to go conquer space, and isn't that our destiny? Manifest destiny? You mean colonize?" Like, the parallels are so blunt. So I don't feel I'm being blunt. I feel I'm telling the truth. I
Mm-hmm.
feel like everyone else is not being blunt enough about colonization and race when they talk about the future. They imagine that it's disappeared. But show me one instance where technology has erased racism. Is a spaceship going to come and end racism? Is that what you're telling me? Because I don't see it happening.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I'm being very blunt, but the question was blunt.
Right. So, returning to the second part of this question, which was the comparison between Verika Samaru as an obviously racialized protagonist and Edmond Dantes as like this otherwise very idealized Western protagonist who is laid low by envy and not any other social conflict whatsoever, and why that was a decision that you made in the work.
Right. So to me, that when I approached this story, I approached it as okay, I mentioned anti-colonial before, and what I wanted to write, when I say the word anti-colonial, I feel, and this is just my feeling, I can't make general statements for anyone else. I feel like what people are expecting is they are expecting a narrative where an exceptional person of color who is different from all of the other members of their group of people is able to navigate through a system and is accepted in that system and then kind of blow up the system from the inside and sort of then the people who they are a part of are able to get freedom, sort of. That is the general, often what I see as presented as an anti-colonial narrative. What I wanted to approach anti-colonial as is the truth of what I see in everyday real life. So, um, racialized people are discriminated against. That is a fact. And science fiction and lets you critique today's social issues by putting it into the future. And so that's why that was really important to me, because as a woman, as a brown woman, as an immigrant, as a queer person, in my everyday life, when I do things, these actors play into how people interact with me. Um, and I did not want to take that away in my book and be like, well, this has no influence on it. Because that's what character is. And so if I'm telling a story about a brown woman, I'm going to have things that affect brown women happen in the story, and that may change the plot.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense? Did I answer the question? I'm kind of rambly. I
No,
have a
you're
lot to
No,
say.
100%.
it does answer the
Yeah.
question because it immediately got to one of the things that I thought was particularly interesting about the framing of Countess, which is Verika is very obviously working within Empire. She is in a high rank in what is obviously an occupying force in space, and is perfectly fine to admit to herself the Isabot Empire is actually kind of rotten to its core, but this is how I ensure that my mother can pay her bills. This is how I ensure I don't get beaten up in the street on a regular basis. And is still also willing to acknowledge that she is proud of her accomplishments and deserves them, and didn't deserve to just suddenly get shafted by a white boy who hasn't accomplished anything in his life. And like that dichotomy is, I think, also true in the real world as well. That on a regular basis we are making decisions to assimilate in spaces that do not like or trust us, while also being fooled by those structures into thinking, well, I deserve to be rewarded, so I deserve to be rewarded by this system that is rewarding me cruelly, that obviously doesn't like me, obviously doesn't trust me. I should feel good about being in this space, even though this space is evil. And like balancing balancing that dichotomy in Verika was actually very fascinating to me. It's kind of why I adored her as a character, being able to say at once that this overall political circumstance is not ideal, but that she did her work, so she deserves to be here. In that exact same breath.
Shaun, did you want to say something?
Oh, okay? I could say 1,000 things, but this is about you, so.
Okay. I think that is something that every immigrant, particularly immigrant, go through, or I mean, I'm saying every, I don't want to speak for everyone, but many people go through. I am a strange case for an immigrant because I was born in the Caribbean and came over to Canada very, very young. And I'm kind of odd that way because I'm not as Canadianized as someone who was actually born here to immigrant parents. I have a little bit of a Trinidadian flair. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but that is something that you are told as an immigrant a lot, that if you assimilate, that if you learn English properly, that if you do everything by the rules, if you work hard, if you pull yourself up by your bootstraps, that you will uh, get yourself out of poverty, and you can join society and you will prosper. I mean, that's why a lot of people immigrate, right? They to come somewhere to have a better life, or more opportunities than what they feel are available to them where they are from. Um, and I was brought up in an area that was very much like that. My mother was very much go to school, get a good education, so you don't have to suffer and you don't have to be a laborer like me, and you don't have to get $2 an hour. Do all the things right, get along in society, be amenable, do all of these things so that you can survive. And I think that's a thing that many immigrant people experience. And you have two ways of going at it. One way is you swallow it whole and you think, yeah, this is the right way to be. And then there's the other way where it's like, I'm doing this, but I know that it's denying myself, or not letting me be who I am. But if I don't do it, I can't eat. So I will go along with what I'm supposed to do. Or you get to the point where there's another group in the book where it's like, no, we are not going to do what you want. And, they are treated like criminals. And I feel like that is reflective of society today.
Mm-hmm.
There are so many things. Oh boy. Uh okay, so I want to tack onto that, but if I can go backwards just slightly, because I think we scratched a surface of something that I'd love to hear you talk more about. We talked about the main character's racial identity, and we've sort of talked a little bit about like the history. But I think that for me in particular, I was rather taken a surprised, I think is more the word, of reading a novel that explicitly refers to a very specific racial prejudice that is very specific to the Caribbean. That all I cannot remember the last time I have seen that in a science fiction work explicitly referenced. And I know that you'd mentioned earlier, talking about indentured servitude. This is part of why I want to ask about this, because if you're looking at the history of a lot of the places in the Caribbean, after emancipation, the end of slavery, at least by the most of the empire, British Empire in particular, 1832, I believe, a huge portion of the population that's brought in to work a lot of the farm labor are indentured servants from places like India, which naturally this book is dealing with that particular group of individuals and dealing with the prejudice that is especially wrought against that particular group of individual, all the different ethnic groups from that region. And I think part of what really fascinates me about this novel is it's such a perfect opportunity to begin to talk about some of that history in a space opera that is explicitly, as you've described, anti-colonial. And I was hoping you could talk a little bit more about trying to weave that sort of historical data, I suppose, or that historical idea of what really happened in the real world into a genre that's typically known for being adventure, Right, historically, it's Star Wars. Like, yeah, we fight the Empire, but like, isn't it kind of fun because my best friend is a robot? Like, these kinds of very adventure-oriented things where the Empire is not really described in anything but almost caricatures. Yours are not caricatures; they're very real to a lot of very real problems that have historically and still exist today. I don't know if that really is a question. I sorta.
So in the book, there are Afro-Caribbean characters and Indo-Caribbean characters. I don't want to like it isn't I don't want to say it is specifically an Indo-Caribbean book. The protagonist, her ancestry is mostly Indo-Caribbean, but I conceptualized her as a bit multiracial because many people in Trinidad are multiracial. Um, and so the book does also reference enslavement and those things. So I don't want to, in the context of Trinidad, I don't want to be like singling out indenture as this separate thing, that it's part of the whole history of the region. But yes, it is my understanding, and it's always dangerous when you say you are the first at something, because somebody will pop up and be like, actually, you are not.
Yeah, don't forget me. I'm also here.
Right. So I don't want to intentionally forget anyone who has written something that I am not aware of. But I am not aware of anyone who has written a space opera, um, or any kind of dark fantasy book that features anyone of any um, part Indo-Caribbean in space. Um, I believe it is the first novella published like that. It is not something that is discussed in science fiction and fantasy at all. So I agree. Actually, the woman who did the audio, Shantae, her part of her background is the same, Indo-Caribbean, and she has said to me that in over her 8 years, 7 or 8 years of audio narration, she has never narrated a book with such a with that type of main character. She's done over a dozen Caribbean books, but never that character. That's not to say that they don't exist in other genres. You can definitely see them in literary, historical, romance, these type of areas. They're there. But in science fiction, no. I have not seen that myself, but it may exist. Um, and I thought that was important to discuss for several reasons. Um, it is a history that is not known generally by most people. When I try to explain to people what I am or who I am or where I come from, many people don't understand. Um, the concept of race in the Caribbean is very different than it is in the US and Canada. Um, it's much more stark in America. I think we can see that now, with what is playing out in politics at the very high level of what are you? Um, Whereas in Trinidad, we wouldn't have such a big problem. Like, we would get it. We would be like, oh, that's what they are, right? We wouldn't have that. So it is, I wanted to write about it because it's me. It's my history. It's the history of Trinidad. It is very, very integral to the history of empire, the use of indentured servants and indentured labor, and no one seems to really write about it. So it seemed like a good opportunity for me to discuss how indentured labor is used. I have seen indentured labor used in science fiction and fantasy, but it is usually as a kink, as a person who is a queer person who is indentured, or it's in a romance or in some type of power dynamic, and not as an actual historical thing that has played out and been pretty brutal to people. So I wanted to go there. Brandon, you laughed when I said that, but I'm sure you've seen it.
No, I was immediately thinking of a dozen examples, and I'm like, I'm not kink shaming anyone, but like, Lord, all you need to read outside of your historical context in this
Kink
couple of things
shaming
about the
anyone
world.
either. Like, I'm all for your things. Like, go ahead and do it. But what I'm saying is, I have never seen it in SFF outside of being a kink. Keep up with the kink. But I am talking about it historically.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things that we, Shaun and I both noticed it in differing levels of intensity. Shaun was actually very surprised by specific instances of racialized language in the book as well.
Oh yes, can I say the word? Can I say the word, or are you guys okay
the only
with
person in this room who can say the word is you.
Okay, can I ask
right?
Okay.
Sorry,
can I ask a question about the, that's fine. I just need to understand. So you've spoken it out, which, so the last time, the short version of the story is Brandon and I think we're talking with some other people, and I was trying to explain that this term exists without saying the term. And Brandon was like, "No, don't say the term." And I was like, "I know, I'm not gonna say it. Like, I got it." But like, to me, that suggests that it has a very deep racialized, prejudicial nature to it, in such a way that, like other racialized terms, it is a thing that only certain people can say. And is that my the only time I see it is in literature. Like, I'm not sitting around like, here, like, tell me these words. Like, it's me seeing characters in stories say it, right? And I don't know that literature always properly conveys what a term really means in its proper social context all the time, because it's a product of those authors' particular biases. So I guess my question is, like, how sensitive is this term actually from somebody who, like, you two have way more personalized experience with this term than I do. This is not a term that comes up in my daily life ever. That makes sense.
Brandon,
help me understand.
You want to answer first?
Oh God. As an Afro-Caribbean person still presently living in Trinidad, one of the things, and this kind of gets back to something that Suzan has already said, which is there is a different experience of the racial experience in the Caribbean. There are things that we instinctively get, things that we instinctively understand, but this is not to say that Trinidad is perfect or ideal in its racial politics by any means. And one of the particularly strong examples of that fact is the fact that language like this persists. When I was in school, when I was still like young, adults would use this word regularly. And like, kind of speaking to that sense of like, there is a unique kind of Caribbean experience where things are obviously not perfect, but things are not to the same extent of hostility that they would be in other parts of the world. Is this very awkward dichotomy where, like, your very elder grandparents or something like that would use a word like that, not meaning harm. And I'm like,
oh,
that's still, like, why did you have to say the word at all, though? But I can't tell you that because you are my granny, and if I talk back to you, you'll hit me. So yeah, it's a lot of that. There is still some, I mean, there is still lingering hostility in the use of the word in some spaces, but there's also that other general awkwardness of, in certain communities, there is not an overt meaning of harm. It's just, we have grown so accustomed to engaging with each other in a certain kind of way that these kinds of things just kind of happen in space.
Language has context and it changes, and I am in Canada. And so this word, if somebody else said it to me who was outside of my community, um, I would not appreciate it. I would be like, you
Mm-hmm.
cannot call me that. However, there are instances where words are reclaimed. So if it was my mother who was kind of saying it to me, right, I would kind of
Mm-hmm.
laugh with her about it, or somebody in group who I'm quite close with, I would be okay with them us laughing back and forth and saying it. I do know also that I have heard, like in Trinidad, I know it's very derogatory to use it. But I have heard in other spaces, and I'm not going to name them, but other islands, other spaces, it is just used as a word, like, oh, well,
Mm-hmm.
that's what they are. So the Caribbean isn't a monolith where it's like in this island, it's bad. And so all across all the islands, it's bad. Other people have not evolved in language the same way as we have. So too long, didn't listen. Um, it's a word that I reclaimed and I wrote it in the book because it is a word that was used historically. It is not a word that I refer to as myself on a daily basis. I would say it in a joking way, maybe with somebody very, very in group. But it is really for historical purposes that I put it in the book.
Yeah. And I mean, it obviously matters in the book that the very first time that it is used, it's used by a white man in power to denigrate Verika.
Right. Those are the people who were using it originally to, that's
Mm-hmm.
why they were bringing them over. They had there was a name for it, like the program, the Coolie program or whatever. So,
You'll see it in a
Mm-hmm.
lot of early 20th century Caribbean lit where it's not just white people who also use the term. It's like filtered down through the different classes as well. So like Middleholzer's Morning at the Office, which I keep trying to get Brandon to read because it's like 100 pages, man. Come on. Uh, like, but it's literally set in an
busy.
office, and it's really just like a microcosm of like what the country is actually structured as. And you'll see it like filtered down through as they're all referring to the Indo-Caribbean character. Different classes are all using this, and it's a way to effectively like try to keep him from moving further up his station. So in a weird way, that book and your book are kind of in a conversation
Well,
unintentionally.
that is an actual term from India, and it
Okay.
was brought in by the British Empire and used for people who were lower classes that they got to do work for them, and then it became the word that they use for train porters. It basically
Mm-hmm.
means day laborer or low wage worker.
Hmm.
Mm-hmm.
So
Interesting.
Yeah,
it's
and
a
then
it's
it
a
just be. Oh, I was just gonna say, like, it's obvious that the problem, like, it's like like a lot of language, the problem isn't the word in a vacuum. It is the context in which it has immediately become racialized, to the point where there are people who don't know what it means. They just know that when you say it, you can hurt someone.
Mhm.
Yep.
Yeah.
Well,
So
so
I would like
oh,
to
go ahead.
ask.
Go ahead. It's okay.
I mean, obviously, the two of us can have we can have conversations for days about all of the obvious racial and Caribbean influenced elements of the book. But I did also want to talk about the queerness.
Mm.
It is obviously kind of remarkable to me. One of the things that I think I like about Verika Samaru as a character the most is, even while all of these things are happening, even while she is a tool of empire, she is perfectly happy meeting a girl that she likes and immediately going, I'm just gonna confess to you that I like you, and we're just gonna deal with that
Mm.
immediately. And I think that that's actually really cool as well. Just like, I feel like in another work, this would be tense and drawn out, and a lot of the way that this, a romance like this would play out would be a matter of, struggling against empires, denigration of queerness. And the book is actually very candid about the fact that even though being lesbian isn't necessarily taboo in this world, it is still there is still an element of judgment attached to it. And telling the story of a protagonist who is still like, I know that this is true, and this still bothers me, but this girl is hot, so I'm gonna let her know that she's hot. Is actually a big deal for me, and I kind of wanted to know why, like, what were the decisions that you wanted to make about queerness in this book?
I think, first of all, I like that you brought up that it wasn't a long, drawn out romance, kind of build up tension, kind of interaction. And none of the romance is really like that in the story. Because there's two. And there's also an allusion to a prison romance kind of thing that I did there, but I won't go into that yet. Very Caribbean, and the thing is that romance is, and not saying that romance novels are not Caribbean, but from a people who listen to soca and calypso, and in soca and calypso, if you see somebody's looking good, you go and tell them you look good, right? You
Mm-hmm.
go jam down with them. Like, it is not something that pining for a long time and this kind of thing. Yes, I do that, I have done that, but in our type of storytelling, in our type of way of talking about relationships and romance, it usually, in our art, is not long and drawn out. It's something that's, hey, you look good, let's go,
Yeah.
kind of thing. So it felt very natural, like, I'm not gonna waste time, I'm gonna just get it on, kind of thing. And that's what I wanted to do. And it ties back into being anti-colonial. It is not meant to read like a Western romance or a Western book.
Mm-hmm. I think that is like one of the elements that I appreciate the most. The idea that even though there is this understanding in the world that Empire sees queerness as some level of threat, we are not telling the story of characters who are afraid of that. And I thought that was actually really radical on its own.
I tend to, in most of my work, have the queerness be the solace for the people. Um, because so much else is bad. So I'm like,
Mm-hmm.
at least you can have. I mean, the queerness goes off on a thing at the end too, so it's not like it ends off perfectly. But I want queer people, when they can exist together and not deal with any of the other things outside, enjoy spending time together. So whatever anyone else is doing. So I want in my work, when queer people are together, not to be crying over the fact that they're queer, because they're gay together, they can have fun. Like, we can worry when we're outside, we're inside now, so we don't have to worry.
Mm-hmm.
Just have a good time.
Yeah, not worrying is what the bed is for.
Yeah.
So if I could take us a slightly different direction, which I think is still related to this, just in a different way. There is this great scene in, I don't know, chapter 2 or 3, I can't remember, pretty early in the book, where there's a court scene. And it's this thing you do throughout the book where you talk about the Empire, and you like litter these little reminders that, hey, like, the Empire is not as benevolent as it keeps pretending to be, right? Obviously, from our main character's perspective, we get that very clearly, but like, the Empire wants us to believe, like, we're beautiful, look how wonderful we are, aren't we so progressive, and like, are we so wonderful? And the court scene really raised this interesting idea that you were exploring, which is two sides. One you kind of raised earlier, which is this idea that, no matter how hard you work, as long as you're still viewed as an outsider by this oppressive system, you can never, there's a barrier you can never exceed. And that system, if it can shoot you down, it will, which is, of course, very early in the book is basically what happens. But there's also this great little blip you put in here about how the Empire really does not like the perception that anybody within its walls may be prejudiced, right? It has to be perceived as, look how benevolent and we're all uplifted, aren't we? So uplifted, so wonderful, as it is doing the very thing that it does not want spoken out. And I really love this little detail because to me it kind of talked, I think like when we talk about Empire, sometimes folks want to deal with like the really obvious stuff, like people being destroyed and killed, and like look at Darth Vader and like these kinds of figures kind of show up and they like cut people down and like they're being obviously oppressive. But those really subtle oppressive components of Empire sometimes don't get their due, and you give a lot of attention to this. And I really kind of was hoping you could talk about why, for you, it was really important to not just give the very obvious stuff, but also all those little insidious threads that kind of manipulate people essentially into cohesion, or whatever the word is, assimilation, if you will, even though it's never good enough.
I always come back to, I'm writing what I know, right? Um, and this is coming across as like, I'm very angry at everybody in science fiction fantasy, and I'm actually not. I mean, you can see I'm smiling. I'm not I'm not really
Yeah.
like angry, but I do see things. And I do I do experience things with people. So for example, you know, some people, when you speak to them, have a really hard time acknowledging that prejudice exists, particularly racial prejudice or racism. They don't want to talk about it um, because it makes them feel uncomfortable. It brings up very sort of feelings of, oh, well, I am part of the system, and even though I'm not racist. I've never done anything to anyone. I've never personally benefited from any type of racial thing. It is a, a reality that exists, but a lot of people like to um build a barrier around that um so that they don't have to deal with the reality of that existing every day and happening to people. So you don't say, oh, this is racist out loud, because when you bring up it's racist, you've broken the social contract, and now the conversation has become hostile. Now the conversation is, oh, I'm on the defensive because, history and all of this stuff, and I'm not like that. People don't want to confront those things. And, I can understand why they're difficult, they're uncomfortable. But I am not able to seal myself off from that at all in any way. I don't get the opportunity to be like, oh, well, racism doesn't exist. Or, oh, like I've had people be like, oh, why are you mentioning that? That doesn't happen at all. And I'm like, really? It happens to me all the time. It happens to me every day. You're not experiencing it doesn't mean it doesn't happen. It doesn't mean it doesn't exist. And so that's kind of what I was getting at, that people don't want to acknowledge things because it makes them feel bad when they do. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and my issue is, if you don't acknowledge it, then we can never change it. Like we can never work towards making a system or breaking the system, because the master's tools cannot break down the master's house. Like we can never rid ourselves of it if everyone isn't ready to be like, yeah, that is a problem. The empire doesn't want to acknowledge there's a problem at all. So how are you going to change it? I'm rambling, but I hope I'm answering the question.
Absolutely. And this leads me
Mm-hmm.
to another question that I want to ask more generally of you as a writer. Um, because some of what you're kind of hinting at to me seems to suggest that if we were writing like a literary fiction book, we might be dealing with things that are very real, right? That are, I mean, we're still dealing with real stuff in this book. I just mean like we can't ignore that what we're dealing with is stuff set in a real world, quote unquote. I mean, literary fiction can still be not the real world, but whatever. But I
We
wonder,
get it.
as a writer, as somebody who writes a lot of speculative fiction, things that are, you know, this empire in this story doesn't literally exist, right? You write stories of horror with fantastical things that occur and all of these kinds of things. Do you find that for you there is something helpful in being able to take these things that are very real and are lived experiences, but transplant them in a context that is, you know, this universe doesn't actually exist, right? This empire is, it has an analog to the real world, but it isn't literally real, right? These characters are fictional characters in a far off future. Is there something useful, you think, as a writer to exploring these ideas in genre, essentially?
Just generally or for me?
For you, or I guess suppose generally, if you have thoughts on either, but I really wanted to kind of hear your personal view.
I think it is easier for me to explore and process things if I have a little bit of distance. The A lot of the experiences in the book, like I am not a space captain and I am not I mean yet could
Yet.
happen. Um but none of these things have happened to me in their one-to-one realistic form. But the emotions and a lot of the situations have happened to me. And as a writer, I think I actually started off writing literary work. Um, and I moved towards speculative because I found that using the sort of metaphorical gave me a little bit more distance from it rather than to write so literary fiction is realistic generally rather than to write like my interaction with my boss, which was, this he sexually harassed me. It's much easier for me to transpose that to a space captain and the guy that she's dealing with there. So yes, it's easier for me to process all of those things. And I like when science fiction adds emotional and interiority to it. I love wonder, I love adventure, I love all of these things, but I like it's a space opera and I like drama and emotion. So I put all my drama into speculative fiction.
From a okay, so if I could flip it around, then as a what about as a reader? Is Do you find that level of distance for you as a reader is also particularly valuable, that spec fic makes, I suppose, makes easier to do than perhaps other non-imaginary genres?
I like when people do it. I like when people put their emotional experience into speculative fiction. I I find it hard to read um like non-fictional accounts of brutality because it over like it I mean I feel also empathetic in speculative fiction, but when I see it in real life, it devastates me. I get really sad and upset when I see a story about, racism and or oppression because I I identify with the person who is going through it, and I identify in speculative fiction as well. But at least I'm like, okay, but at least it's speculative, so I can kind of rein in my over empathy. I think I'm kind of over empathetic. So I have an easier time dealing with speculative work.
That's interesting. I would describe my wife very similarly as over empathetic, but she's like weirdly more extreme. She can't handle, does not like any depiction of like extreme violence like at all. I mean, even like people getting blown up in spaceships is like too much. And which I find very interesting. And at some point, I will ask her why. Where's that come from? And the only thing I've heard is it basically upsets her calm. Um, that's the answer I've been given.
It's people getting blown up, so it's not really good. Like,
It isn't, right? When you think about all of these great melodramatic space operas we watch, like a lot of times, a lot of people die in those. And
well, and
Yeah.
that is something I was concerned about with the book too. I didn't want to create a general who was just like, I'm going to make this decision. 50,000 people die, but it doesn't matter if the 50,000 people die because my purpose is freedom on this side, right? Like I didn't want to do that trajectory with the book because I felt like, but those 50,000 people matter.
this is
Yes.
super interesting because if you look at like early space opera, that's not part of a lot of early space opera conversations. Like a lot of times things just get wiped out, and it's like a video game kind of, like they're not really people at that stage. But in so much more modern space opera, this question you're raising comes up so much more, right? The stakes and the costs of actual human life, or non-human life for that matter, is much more pronounced. And I wonder if that has it's a thing I'm pondering. I don't have an answer to it, but I wonder, and maybe you have a thought, if that has something to do with just how much our sensibilities about perpetrating violence against other people culturally has shifted, where like even now you're looking at a lot of the political situations in the world, and people are understandably really sick and tired of, you know, basically their names being dragged into murdering people because their country is involved in it in some way. I don't know if that is something going on worldwide, but it does make me wonder, because so much more space opera isn't just the happy-go-lucky farm boy adventure anymore, which is fine, but we get so much more of what you're talking about. I don't know.
There's a question there, right?
I
I
guess
think
kind
we
of.
are
Yeah.
we are I mean, we are exposed to all kinds of different media now. And we we don't have just one outlet telling us this is what we're working towards and this is what we're doing. We're getting varying viewpoints, and we're seeing typically people who don't have power to show what's happening showing us. And so people are able to be like, hey, wait a second. It's not good what's
Yeah.
happening. And we didn't have that sort of mass, um the quantity, but also the ability to like mass distribute different points of view instantaneously like we do now. And so it's much harder to control what the population thinks because you can get disparate points of view. And I think maybe that's what's going on partially.
You might be right. It could have a big
Hmm.
factor. I remember having a conversation with some colleagues of mine who are from a somewhat older generation, and they were having trouble understanding why so many of their like 19 to 22-year-old college students had such very strong opinions about like the Israel-Palestine situation in the early days of when it had started. And I remember them just not quite understanding like it, the perspective they were sharing was one of a lot of what you're talking about. They are seeing things happening and are reacting not to a media narrative that is telling them like what's moral or not. They're reacting to images and ideas that they're seeing that are coming like from the ground. And so their opinions are not being informed by like a historical interpretation of like the region, or like what NBC is telling them. It's like, what are they getting on their TikTok and their social media accounts and from their friends.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This actually speaks to a thing that I thought was actually very interesting when you were speaking earlier about like not wanting to portray Verika as someone who, in order to keep her station, is willing to do all these kinds of reckless, violent things. One of the things that I thought was particularly arresting about the courtroom scene is the fact that all of the questions that opposing counsel asks Verika on the stand are things where the obvious manipulative goal of that counsel is to put Verika in a position where it is not obvious to simply point out nothing wrong has happened here. Like it would be very easy in like another space opera scenario to put a character like Verika in a situation where a superior like looks her in the eye and goes, "You need to wipe out these 50,000 people, or you will not remain captain of this ship." And you need to now hem and haw about, do I really want to sacrifice these people in order to continue achieving my goals? But it's far more interesting to me to tell the story of someone going, none of the things that I did were wrong. And I am witnessing the most insidious part of the imperial structure that I'm a part of literally go, we don't care. What cares is we can cast our opinion any way that we want, because no one else can tell us that our opinion is wrong. And I think the fact that they worked so hard to do that, the fact that it was a railroaded experience from the beginning, the entire experience was a kangaroo court, because they knew that they could control whether something looked bad or not, in ways that they cannot control the death of thousands of people, the subjugation of thousands of planets, is particularly interesting in the way that that scene was framed. And I guess the question that I have for you is, why was it important to make Empire look so specifically insidious, when just making them look bombastically evil will do for a lot of readers?
You know, that's interesting, because some people have told me that I made the Empire, the people in the Empire, very cartoonish. So there's differing interpretations depending on who you are. And we had talked when we got cut off, I had told you who thinks that.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a certain it's not, I'm not gonna say like only those people, but there is a certain demographic that tends to think that. I mean, to me, that's just the truth, right? I mean, you're like, why did you decide to do that? Well, because we have seen there are instances where people who are not guilty of a crime get sentenced to jail for the crime. There are instances where people, historically, I'm going to bring up Emmett Till, um, didn't do anything, right? Was judged. People murdered him. It what part of what the book is about is that when you're in a system that, you know, makes laws and you have to follow them, they decide what's the truth. You don't get to decide what's the truth. So that's what's going on in that scene. She hasn't done anything maliciously criminal necessarily. She's broken some rules, but it's enough that she's broken the rules to be like, well, you're not one of us. You're not I don't know what the word is, a conformist enough. You've got this kind of thing within you where you're daring to do things that are outside what we find acceptable. And anytime you're in that situation, somebody can say, you know what, you're undesirable and you don't belong here. And I just feel like that happens in the legal system just generally. It's not a stretch.
Mm-hmm.
There's literally the Innocence Project in the United States, which is, I don't know if they work internationally, but which is entirely about investigating people sitting in prison right now for crimes where the evidence is not sufficient enough to, or the investigation was not done well enough to actually justify it, where there's sufficient evidence to suggest they did not do it. And a number of people have been released from life sentences for murders they literally didn't commit, because DNA was sitting in a lab somewhere and they just didn't have time. They didn't have the ability to check it at the time because the technology didn't exist. And when prompted, they just went, no, we won't do it. We'll just leave him in there for forever. Yeah.
No, but that's how, that's the example of how the system is broken, right? There was a case just a couple of months ago of someone who was on death row for a crime that they didn't commit. Got a retrial. The retrial determined that the evidence was not sufficient for them to have been charged. And then the Attorney General in that state went, but the evidence notwithstanding, everything else about the case assumes that judgment should still hold. So we're gonna leave them on death row anyway. I'm like, you're saying that you know that they didn't do it, but the court, but court did the thing anyway? It's like, this is weird and bad. But it speaks to this kind of, because the thing that works about that court case in the book for me is every specific thing they ask Verika about isn't a crime. And it's only a crime put together if you assume the worst about her going in.
Well, exactly.
Having a coin is not a crime.
But it's you have this coin and it represents something, and so what does that mean about you and who you are? That case that you're referring to is going on right now. They're trying to stop someone from capital punishment who has not committed the crime. So for me, I just felt like I was writing the truth. All my answers are going to be like, this is everyday life.
Yeah, this is just happening.
Yep. Unfortunately,
but I mean,
very true.
The thing that makes it radical in the book is being able to observe it while also acknowledging, well, it's not happening because no one's paying attention. It's happening because people are paying attention all of the time.
There's some,
and
they
because
have to actively uphold it.
Yeah, there are people who this is probably me reading into all of the white people in the book, but characters like Whitehall don't care. The only person who gets to care what the Aesabot Empire is doing is Verika, because Verika is making a choice about how to live. Everybody else is like, yeah, this is the world. And they're upholding it because they can, and because they know how. But they get to forget that it's affecting people all the time. The thing that they care about is that they know how it can.
Yes, and they can use it.
Mm-hmm. That they have to think very deeply about using it, but not because it's hard for them to do so, but it's because it's very easy.
I agree.
I just
it's a lot. Yeah.
Everybody needs to read the book, y'all. I have a lot of feelings about this book.
It's a very interesting book. I want to ask
Thank
one.
you. I like the book.
You're allowed to like the book.
I hope so.
It's yours.
You would.
I know it's it's different, but I like it.
Mm-hmm.
Different's not bad. That's fine. Not every book needs to be the same book. Gosh darn it.
Yes.
Yeah,
true.
we can have different stuff. I want to ask one last question. And before we do our wind-up questions, because otherwise we'd keep you here literally forever. But you had mentioned
Which we can, but you deserve to sleep.
Yeah.
No, I have cleared my life for you.
Okay. No,
Lord.
that's not fair.
We don't deserve all of that, I'm pretty sure. Oh, Lord. But yes, your question.
So at the very beginning, you had mentioned Star Trek and just kind of offhand, little note. And I remember mentioning to Brandon, I was like, oh man, there's like a element of Star Trek in here. And I don't know if you pulled from the exact same movie that came up in my mind, but it's the one where Kirk goes to Klingon prison for the supposed murder of somebody that the evidence does not strongly suggest he actually did, right? Because there's a lot of similarities. But the thing that stood out to me in thinking of that comparison was the relative positions of those two figures. You know, Kirk is a person that is only an outsider because he chooses to break the rules. Otherwise, he would be perfectly fine in the whole, like, you know, the like Confederation systems. He'd be perfectly fine. He'd probably be an admiral times 12 already. Verika is a person who is an outsider not by her own choice and is doing the opposite. She's trying not to break the rules and do everything that's asked of her. And they both end up in the same place. And I don't know if that's exactly what you were thinking of when you mentioned like little blip of Star Trek, but I don't know if you have thoughts on this, but that immediately came to my mind and it made me very conscious of that comparison.
I think that's similar to what you brought up in the beginning, what was brought up about Count of Monte Cristo. It's the same kind of parallel where it's like, um, though Edmund doesn't do anything specifically illegal or against anything, but it's the same situation where it's like this person is being persecuted, but it's because of their actions, and this person is being persecuted, and yeah, their actions are kind of open to interpretation, but it's because of who they are and it's because of what someone else wants. So, yeah, that is exactly the same sort of thing I was doing there. But also, just in general, I really like original Star Trek. Just in general. So when I started writing the book, right, she's sitting in her captain's chair and she's got like, and it's just like Kirk, right? He's sitting in his chair and he's got the people in front of him and he's talking and being like, you know, communications this, blah, blah. That is 100% Star Trek. And then there's a scene later on where there's kind of like a chase, um and it was very like, you know, in Star Trek when it's always Scotty has to fix the warp drive in 10 minutes, otherwise something is gonna happen and they're gonna blow up, right?
Yeah.
I wanted
Mm-hmm.
that kind of adventure to come, energy, kind of deadline stuff to be in the book as well, because you know I told you I threw everything in there. So that's very much, I love Star Trek, so that's very much where that came from.
That's great. So like a little bit of like love letter to the stuff you really like in Star Trek is in here too.
Yeah,
That's yeah.
I think Star Trek is great. I like Star Wars too. I like both. I'm not one of those one or the other kind of people. Don't
Yeah.
write me. Don't attack me. Don't-
Mm-hmm.
I like both, but I really like original Star Trek. He's so melodramatic. He's a Shakespearean actor, right? So he's always like,
Mm-hmm.
"Ooh."
He should be holding
Yeah.
a
Something that,
skull like half the time. Yeah.
yeah.
Mm-hmm. I feel like liking original Star Trek also speaks to the intensity of the romantic engagements in this book as well, because
Right.
Kirk is always, I like you, I'm gonna let you know one time and we're just gonna start kissing immediately, and they just, everyone else just has to deal with that. So
He
yeah.
has a woman on every planet, right? And I
Mm-hmm.
mean that's kind of, you know, out of like, it's, you know, don't agree and all these things. But in the show, he's got a girlfriend a lot of the time, a new girl. And Verica
Yeah.
is doing that. She shows up and she's like, hey.
Yeah. If Kirk can do it, why can't Eureka?
You know what? If
Yeah.
everyone's consenting, let them have at it. You know?
Yeah.
That's I
She is
mean,
very adventurous with that aspect of her life.
yeah. I
Mm-hmm.
think that's perfectly
Even
fine.
even when her life is in danger.
Yeah, she's like, well,
Yeah.
you only live once and my life might end, so
Ah, carpe diem.
Oh Lord.
Ah,
So we could talk for another hour and a half, as we already have, about this book. But one of the things that we obviously would like to know now is, what are you working on next?
I just got back the comments of an actual novel that I'm trying to write from my agent, and it is only like you remember you were talking about how you only had a certain amount of words for your novel that you're writing, Brandon.
Mm-hmm.
It's not novel length yet. So I am working on this, and it is a Trinidadian Edwardian Gothic horror novel. I've left sci-fi and gone back to my horror roots for a bit. So
Mm-hmm.
I have to expand this book. It has something about Trinidad in it, related to industrialism in Canada and New York. I can't tell you exactly what it is
Hmm.
because it's an actual thing that you know me, I'm always dealing in the truth. So
Mm-hmm.
it is a thing that happened, um, and it comes back to haunt people.
Oh,
Oh ho. I
that
am
sounds
very
fun.
intrigued.
Yeah,
Scream
it's
at
like
us.
actual history stuff. I mean, the monster isn't historical, but the reasons for the
Mhm.
monster is.
Yes.
I
I'm
want to
very
make a joke
excited.
about what if he is actually historical, but like, I mean, I get it. Like, technically, like crypto things don't necessarily. Well, crypto coin does, but that's a whole different monstrosity.
Oh
Not
god.
crypto zids. What's the word? Oh god, I mean, the name is
Cryptids is the
Cryptid.
word that you're
cryptids.
looking for.
I want to say
Thought you were talking
cryptozoids.
about crypto like Bitcoin at first.
My
Yeah, I
mouth and
saw
my
Shaun
brain
was
went different.
heading there and then took the wrong turn. It's like,
Yeah,
yes.
sorry. My brain and my mouth went different directions, and it was too late. By the time the word left my mouth, I was like, crap. So,
It's
yeah,
Oh
okay.
lord.
I've had that
Mm-hmm.
happen in teaching and have said some truly embarrassing things that I will not reiterate while I'm live on stream, but maybe one of you can ask
Mm-hmm.
me about it later. Okay, the
Oh
other
lord.
question where can folks find you?
Well, I'm kind of everywhere. Um, but I still function on Twitter at Silly Syntax and on Blue Sky. Actually, Blue Sky has picked up a bit lately, um, which I am kind of enjoying.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm on Blue Sky at Silly Syntax. And then on Instagram, I'm Gothic Syntax. So those are the social media things. I went darker there. And the website, but I always forget the actual address. So just type in Suzan Palumbo website and it'll come up. If you write Suzan Palumbo, my face just shows up. So it's fine. That's how you'll find me. You don't
I
have
mean,
to search really hard.
you should consider yourself very pleased in the overall writing sphere that you have such a unique name that it is very
Hmm.
easy to find you.
I think it's not necessarily unique. There are other Susan Palumbos, but there is not one who is making such foolishness of herself publicly to be recorded everywhere. So this is why I'm first. It's not like, oh, intelligence, or it's just ridiculousness. First in ridiculousness.
Well, we'll
Mm-hmm.
make sure that
Fair.
your website is linked in the show notes for this episode. But Susan, thank you very much for coming on the show. This is wonderful to have you here.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for letting me like ramble these answers and be very honest. I appreciate the chance to like talk candidly about things because they're important to me. This art is my life and it's very important. So I'm very happy that you invited me and I had a great time.
Well, you're welcome to
Really.
come back. We can
Oh,
find
thank you.
excuses. Yeah,
Mm-hmm. When the next book happens, we will summon you once again.
we could find an excuse. Brandon still has to
I
read a
might be
morning at
about
the
90,
office.
so we gotta hold on to our health.
Oh lord.
That's fair. That's fair. Well, okay, for folks at home, thank you very much for being here. If you'd like to let us know what you thought about this episode, or if you perhaps have read this book and you want to let us know what you thought about it, you can go to skiffyandfanty.com/listener suggestions, or you can email us at skiffyandfanty@gmail.com. We're Skiffy Fanty pretty much on every social network, I think. You can find our newsletter and our Patreon and all of that stuff on our link tree, which is linktr.ee/skiffyandfanty, or just go to skiffyandfanty.com. It's probably out there somewhere. I'm at ShaunDuke.net. Alphabet Streams is presently where Skiffy and Fanty streams every Friday at 7 p.m. We do some new episode thingamabobber. So come here on Twitch on Alphabet Streams, and I'm in other places. My link tree is /ShaunDuke.
And you can find me, Brandon O'Brien, almost everywhere on the internet at The Rising Tides, and at my newsletter, which is also my website, at brandonobrien.xyz.
Yeah, Brandon is many places, and is even like a poet laureate now.
Yes, that has also happened. I am very excited about being the poet laureate of Seattle Worldcon. I'm not going to bring it up very often. I'm very bad at reminding people that I'm apparently cool, but apparently I'm cool.
Well, I'm going to bring it up almost every single time we're on a show together. So until finally you get the Nobel Prize for Literature. So,
nope.
We'll make it happen after I take over the organization myself. Yeah.
Fair enough.
Anyway, okay. Well, I think that's sufficiently awkward since I've just given out my plans for literary award domination, I suppose. So, oops, I gave it away. So, on that note, awkward ending, and see.